you, Mr. Ramprasad Gimari and Dr. Ahmed for your kind introductions. So yes, I have a very close affiliation with Nepal for a very long time. In fact, I went there for my own honeymoon, if that's of any interest to you. So that is my personal connection. So, but anyway, so let's just continue. I will be trying to give you a sort of global overview, not only of Nepal, but Nepal will feature quite prominently in the discussions today. And so before I go into the presentation, just to say that, as you mentioned, that there are two parts to this discussion. The first part, I'll be focusing on building codes and disaster resilience. And in the second part, I'll be focusing on post-disaster housing reconstruction. And then in between, I'll try to find out where the linkages lie between these two different domains. And I welcome any questions from you. Please post them in the chat box and then we can respond to them. We could even have a discussion at the end of it. So let me share my screen with you if I can. No, I need to.
Kumarji, could you please make him co-host or something like that so that he can share?
No, I think I should be able to share it.
Yeah.
Yes, can you see the PowerPoint?
Absolutely, absolutely. Very
That is good. I will try to move the window a little bit to the corner. Okay, so let's just start. So as I mentioned, there are two parts and I will go into it. Before I do that, I'd like to show you a very short video clip, and please keep your questions to mind because I want to provoke you by showing this video. And I will pose my own questions to you after seeing this at the end of it, and we have a Q&A. But so let me see if I can run it. Yes.
We are proud individuals living for the city, but the flame couldn't go much higher. We find and religions to paint us with salvation, but no one, nobody can give you the power to rise over love. Down the wall of a dream that cannot breathe in its harsh reality. Mass confusion, spoon-fed to the blind, serves now to define our cold society from which we'll rise. I got no
misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men with machine minds and machine hearts. You are not machines, you are not cattle, you are men. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. Let us use this power, let us all unite.
And we'll rise, oh my love, and oh my.
Okay, I'll stop this here. I think you get the message. And my question to you is that how much is this compliant with your codes, the Nepal Building Code, NBC, and also whether organizations outside can come and do what they actually want in a country. This was done after the Nepal earthquake with good views, but let's revisit this when we go back to the discussions. So, talking about that, now this is a project that we were working on as my friend Ahmed had introduced. And this was a project which was funded by the Asia Pacific Network for Global Change Research, looking at building codes and disaster resilience in these two countries, Bangladesh and Nepal. And you're based in Nepal, I don't have to tell you that despite all the efforts, there's a very large, substantial amount of buildings in both these countries are constructed informally. And even in the formal sector, people don't follow codes. They try to cut corners. They try to, like do all kinds of strange things, as you're well aware. And in many countries, for example, in Australia, building codes and planning regulations, they're integrated. It's part of the same program. But here, not. They have planning regulations in terms of, say, setbacks or accessibility and all that. But that is not part of the building code. So there are two different things. And then also enforcement and compliance, two main issues. Enforcement, of course, is there someone who wants to ask a question? I think it's Suchitra. Suchitra, yes, thank you. Yeah, so basically enforcement and compliance. Enforcement, of course, makes you think of a policeman with a pistol holding it at your head and saying that, hello? Yes, I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
No, first mute everybody and don't ask now. Please mute everybody.
I don't think I can do it from my end.
Okay, no, somebody will do that.
Yeah, okay.
You please go ahead.
Okay, sir, I'll check from my end. I will mute if I'll mute, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, so look, we'll just carry on then. I mean, I'm happy to take questions, but in between, I think they'll disrupt our format. So, okay, so enforcement compliance. Enforcement, of course, makes you think of someone, a policeman, forcing you to do certain things. You are enforced to do it. And compliance is much more from yourself, that you know that there are certain rules and you follow it. If there's a stoplight, don't cross the road. When the stoplight allows you to cross, you cross. So that's compliance. And enforcement, of course, if you're jaywalking, then you get a fine slapped onto your face. So these are very simple ideas. But enforcement, of course, faces hurdles in many of these countries, various hurdles in countries like Bangladesh, which I'm very familiar with, and also in Nepal. There are ways of bypassing those enforcement mechanisms, whether paying bribes and all kinds of things. And so that is one side of the story. The other side of the story is that it's affordability. And many of these countries, Bangladesh, Nepal, they have a vast bulk of people who are living on the fringes of the poverty line. And hence for them, affording building codes is sometimes unimaginable. So having that kind of context in mind, we started thinking of what if there's something like a gray building code. And just to give you an idea what this gray building code is all about. And we faced a lot of criticism from especially official quarters in both these countries. And the gray building code is like what we have on paper is the white building code. That's the white paper. And what is actually being practiced on the ground is the black building code, like black money. It's not black, it's not bad, but it's not legal. And so what we thought is that perhaps if there's something in between, which is neither white nor black, but gray, and which focuses primarily on saving people's lives through disaster resilience mechanisms and features, then perhaps that might be a way to go forward, and people could be incentivized to comply to that kind of idea. Okay, so I will talk more about this notion. And so our research problem, what it was that, yes, if they are now with the gray building codes, we were subscribing to what we call the safe building codes. The safe building codes focus primarily on reducing disaster risk. And so if only the safe building codes are followed, forget about the rest. Accessibility, green building features, electrical, fire, all that. Fire perhaps belongs to the safe building codes as well, but water supply, all those other issues that come into building codes, leaving that aside for now, if you're thinking of the bulk of the people in our countries, if they could be only allowed to follow, or kind of not allowed, but supported to follow the safe building codes, then they would have some disaster resilience. Of course, the famous saying, earthquakes don't kill people, buildings do, that comes into play here. And then you look at some of these features, that many of these disasters are not natural. I don't believe in the term natural disasters, because there are no natural disasters. All disasters are human induced in some way or the other. It's because of our vulnerability, where we live and what we do. So, and you look at these examples, there's the Rana Plaza example, many of you may be aware of it. There's the large garment factory in Bangladesh, which collapsed in 2013. And you can see the kind of damage, and more than 1,100 women mainly workers died inside it. So it's about compliance. If you know the history behind this building originally had foundations for 4 floors, and they built it up to 9 floors. So things like that. So a lot of this is just not only people's lack of awareness or non-compliant nature, but it's also greed. It's human greed, the greed to make profit at the easiest way possible. So I think, yeah, so this is what it is. And now, because of the Rana Plaza and the Gorkha earthquakes in Nepal 2015, I think there's much more awareness. I think the awareness in Nepal started after 1988, when my friend Ahmed and his organization NSET did a lot of wonderful work in promoting building codes and disaster resilience. So, but then this kind of augmented the awareness, and so at this point, I think there's opportunity for this voluntary compliance, leaving aside the enforcement issue. And already there is some gradual paradigm shift, and the people are following, and there are certain municipalities in Nepal where there's voluntary compliance. From our studies, I believe there's Lalitpur had already done voluntary compliance, and then recently Dharan and Timi, some of these municipalities. So you can fill me in more detail about these places in Nepal. So why did we focus on Bangladesh and Nepal? Basically, when people talk about South Asia, they think primarily about India. Now, India is a very different ball game from our countries, Bangladesh, Nepal, etc. Because first of all, overall South Asia has got low socioeconomic development and all that, and the impacts in that region is profound. But what we started thinking is that the smaller countries, they have less capacity, less resources than the larger countries like India. So we started focusing on the smaller countries. We had done more research projects in Sri Lanka and the Maldives and Bhutan, and we put them all together into this new book, which is published last year. And when we talk about disaster resilience in South Asia, we actually talked about these 5 countries. We didn't include Pakistan because of security reasons. We were not able to do any research there, and Afghanistan as well. But we could focus on these 5 smaller South Asian countries, which came out in this book, which includes Nepal. And the case study in this book on Nepal builds on the post-disaster reconstruction work done after the Gorkha earthquakes. So one of the things is that we started looking at some global frameworks, and globally throughout the world, I think many organizations are taking building codes quite seriously, disaster resilience quite seriously. From the Hugo framework of action to the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. These have started being highlighted in the SFDRs and their framework. They have said to encourage the revision of existing or the development of new building codes and standards. So that has become a priority in the global policy agenda. In the Sustainable Development Goals, again, support least developed countries, including through financial and technical assistance in building sustainable, resilient buildings, utilizing local materials. So that is also quite important to understand. And there are other campaigns, UNISDR Resilient Cities campaign, they also say similar things, and prominent agencies like the World Bank. The World Bank has a disaster building resilience and disaster codes program. JICA, USA, they all promote, some of the bigger organizations all promote this compliance and uptake of building codes. So this is now actually on the policy agenda globally. So looking at safe building codes, globally, again, in developing countries, they've mainly been adapted from developed countries. They are like maybe 14th generation photocopies of the building codes in the United States or Canada or whatever. In our part of the world, in Australia, nearby in the Pacific Island countries, when I go and do my research work in countries like, say, Fiji or elsewhere, Vanuatu, for example, where I've been recently being engaged, I see that the building codes that they are following are basically copies of building codes of New Zealand and Australia. Now, how contextual are they? How relevant are they? How affordable are they? Some big questions, because they don't have those resources. And also they have very large informal sector populations, also extended rural areas where these kind of building standards are just not possible. It's just not feasible for most people. And what I said before also, that building codes overall, they have different standards, safety, health, comfort, all that. But to focus on the safety aspects, I think human lives are invaluable. You cannot put a monetary figure on it. So let's focus on that. So that is the basic idea. And in fact, that is how building codes started. The earliest building code started after the big fire in England, for example. And so this is what it is. And you start seeing that the term, the safe building codes, is not used that widely, but now in the United States, for example, they have a new Safe Building Code Incentive Act. So it has been legislated. And through the legislation, the government actually gives you money if you're going to invest in disaster resilience in your buildings. And so this is what we had been trying to look at in our work here. So now I come back again to the gray building codes that we said. Now, gray literature is basically a form of non-commercial publication. That is where the term has been coming from. But I also gave you the etymology of the term in terms of the white building codes and the black building codes on the other hand. And what we try to do is to develop a simplified handbook, thinking of the very large semi-literate population that live in these countries, and where there'll be different options. It's not like you have to follow just this one, but the site conditions may be different, the affordability might be different. So basically give them a menu of options. Just think about it, that if you and me, we go out for dinner, and then I have $5 in my pocket and you have 10, then we're not going to order the same thing. Okay, so this is the kind of situation, they're giving different options. And so you can see the gray building code is also been translated into Bengali and Nepali. And these are freely available on the internet. I'm more than happy if you use it. Unfortunately, this project time frame was only for 1 year, and we had envisioned that our Nepali partners would be using this to, advance it further. We have no idea where that went, and we will need to follow this up. But we are more than happy for you to use these handbooks. I will send you the link. I will send it through Ahmed. So what is voluntary compliance all about? We are talking about compliance, but it is this notion that people become aware, they start believing that if they follow it voluntarily, it's for their own good. It's like, think of it, that you're ill and you need to take medicine. If you don't want to have your medicine, then you get ill. So you know that the medicine is actually good for you, you might as well have it. And so that is the voluntary compliance. So at night, before you go to sleep, you're supposed to follow the prescription and you have that. So that is the kind of idea that we have, a very simplified version of the problem. And the other is that the large bulk of the buildings, they're just all being done informally, whether you like it or not. And so the building code is very hard to enforce. It needs a lot of money to enforce it, to police it, and then in between there's all the subversion through corruption and all that kind of stuff. So we need to find a very different approach to promote disaster resilience, and that is the voluntary compliance. And voluntary compliance comes through awareness building, through knowledge transmission, through capacity building. And so it's not only about forcing people to do things, not about enforcement regulations. It's a form of social transformation, if that's the word for it, where people have this compliance culture. And this cartoon kind of encapsulates this all. It says that it was worse than guilty. The jury found me non-compliant. So he says that, non-compliance is worse than being guilty. So anyway, so that's a little anecdote for you. And so looking at the way we started looking at these issues, this framework that I gave you is to look at the idea of building back better, and also disasters that they present this window of opportunity. And this is the juncture where you could build back better by enforcing or applying or having free will compliance to the building codes. And this is the opportunity. This is a point in time when there's this opportunity to make countries like Nepal, after the earthquake, safe, countries like Bangladesh safe from the disasters that happen, like man-made disasters like Rana Plaza. So this is our question, and I won't read it out to you. Basically, it's a very long code. How can compliance, this voluntary safe building codes, be facilitated? So this is what it is for disaster resilience. We're focusing on disasters. That is why the yellow highlights. And if you look at the sub-questions, we're looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the building codes, disaster resilience globally, and then also the project countries. And they will also focusing on the institutional community stakeholders, because without them, it cannot happen. So that is what it is. And finally, looking at developing policy and practice guidelines, and that would facilitate voluntary compliance. And this kind of idea, this approach is not going to provide easy solutions. People have been working on this wicked problem for a very, very long time. But perhaps the notion of promoting voluntary compliance is the small germination of an idea of social that leads to social transformation and long-term understanding and application of building codes. So I won't go through this in great detail, only just to tell you that we had different ways of looking at this problem. We reviewed global literature, local literature, then we had consultations with key stakeholders in these countries at both institutional community levels. And then we started producing the policy and practice guidelines, of which the Grey Building Handbook is one of those outcomes. And through the project, we also involved the early career researchers, and I will show you some of them in the subsequent slides. Is also continuing 2 years after we finish the project with this kind of webinar, when we have established the networks through these projects. And these networks also, of course, allow regional and international knowledge dissemination and sharing of ideas. So some of these photographs, and I just want to show you some of these because these are people some of you may know quite well. Being in Nepal, it was the first planning workshop that we had, and our partner in Nepal was Tribhuvan University. So you can see them here. And then we had an interim workshop in Dhaka, and we took some of our Nepalese partners to Dhaka to interact with the Bangladeshi partners. The Bangladeshi partners were from Dhaka University and BRAC University. And Ahmed mentioned the EVRC, Earthquake Vulnerability Reduction in Cities course that we ran together in 2002 in Bangladesh, which was organized by BRAC University, which, similar to Tribhuvan University, has a master's in disaster management program. And this photograph is quite interesting. That is the site of the Rana Plaza factory that I mentioned, which it had collapsed completely. And so there's a memorial to the workers in that site. And then the final workshop, when we launched the Grey Building Handbook, I forgot the name of this gentleman. Perhaps you will be able to remind me, but he actually launched, I think he works in the Urban Development Directorate, but he launched this book. You can see some of our partners from the different countries: Haridarshan Shrestha, Nagendra Sitola from Tribhuvan University, and Cord? Yes, no, Cord. called, I'm sorry, and then Humayun and Farooq from Bangladesh. So this is what it was. So actually, if I can go back to that one, I can show a very small video clip also where we were actually taken to one of the compliant municipalities. I believe it was Dharan. Again, my memory slips, but there was also a very beautiful temple where they had incorporated earthquake-resistant features. Okay, I can see also that our good friend and colleague Basantaraj Adhikari, he is also in this webinar, who was also one of our partners from Tribhuvan University, Lalitpur. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for refreshing my memory. Okay, so now finally, where are we? We are trying to steer the crossroads between this notion of enforcement versus the crossroad of meeting voluntary compliance through people's own urge. And so, so on one hand, there's the aspiration of international good quality building codes and all that. On the other hand, there's a very large amount of people who live in informal settlements or people who don't have the affordability, living on the fringes, as I mentioned, of the poverty line. And so we need to kind of work with balancing this building regulation capacity, which has come about because of the successive disasters, with the sensitivity for the people of the country, people who live in informal settlements. And in this particular context, perhaps we could follow a training of trainers approach, that we have these ideas and we train people who train others, and through that process, the idea of voluntary compliance takes root. You can see this photograph. This one is actually a drawing from the famous engineer Arya, who died, who was one of the first proponents of looking at earthquake resistance of non-engineered buildings in the world. And some of these ideas we had been trying to implement. This was a project that we had done in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, after the 2005 earthquake. And training of trainers. This was for construction workers who are working on site, and we had hands-on exercises and showing them the corner reinforcement technique. It was something very simple. So the key outputs, and these are all available, and you can see the links. You can download the full report from there. There's a research paper that was published from that, as you can see from the link. And we also produce a video which is available on YouTube. You can see it. I won't show you the whole video, but I just want to show you the little bits and pieces where you can see what what our partners and our colleagues from Nepal said.
Awareness is one of the best tools on the voluntary compliance, and awareness mainly in two aspects. One is on the quality construction and also the design, drawings, and also to follow the building code. That is the one level of awareness that is a little bit technical. And another awareness is basically the impact. What will be the impact if the building will not be resilient or as per the building code. Therefore, these two types of awareness program, if we could do to the people, then they will realize the implementation of the building code. That does mean the voluntary compliance.
Disaster or earthquake does not kill people, but infrastructure or building kill. This is a famous saying about the disaster. That's why if we build a good building, we can save life and property. That's why to achieve this good building or resilient city, building code is the most important tools for control the quality and control the minimum requirement of the building strength. So that building code is the most vital thing for to make resilient cities.
Right, that is important, but I also want to show you someone else who was vital to the project from the Nepalese end.
For that really interesting as
university, it made it a big opportunity for me.
And the experience that I got is that I always like to work on the field, on the real ground. And this project gave me that opportunity to work on the ground and to know the problems over there.
Look, so that is what it is. It is what she said, Inu Pradhan, is that the opportunity to work on the ground. And this is what we always talked about, working with the informal sector, people who are marginal, people who are vulnerable, people who cannot afford the building codes, but yet the necessity of safeguarding their lives is perhaps paramount. So we need to work on the ground. And I think she summarized it very nicely. So let me just go on to the next portion. So that is the end of my building code section. So I'll go to the next section, which is about the post-disaster housing reconstruction. And this is an area which I've been doing a lot of work in. Ahmed today posted a photograph of myself, I think, blowing a trumpet about this webinar. So I will blow my trumpet a little bit more and show you about some of the work that I had done in this area. This is a book that was published where we're looking at post-disaster housing reconstruction, these 6 countries, including developed and developing countries. And so USA and Australia, but also our smaller countries. Nepal was not in this book, unfortunately, and then I've already talked about your disasters in South Asia book, but this was also very important that as Inu had said, working on the ground, it's about community engagement. It's about, and this is what we also looked at. So this is a book that I co-edited and this book has got 13 countries from 5 different continents, covering the different aspects where how communities actually engage and even drive the process of post-disaster reconstruction recovery. So looking at housing, why is housing important? Why focus on housing? You might say safety, health is more important and all these other things. Yes, certainly. But this little study done by our good colleague from ECLAC, UN ECLAC, and this study that he had done after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami in Aceh found out that the housing sector experienced the maximum amount of damage, far exceeding all the other sectors, whatever you call it, transport and education and all that. And so you can see that this is such an important sector, and this is so vividly illustrated by the disasters that happened, vividly and tragically. So looking at housing, we can call it sheltering. How do people shelter? Before a disaster, people build, extend, upgrade, they do all kinds of things, try to get money, cash, contract labor, self-help to construct and to maintain their houses. And then they have the disasters, and beyond that, they will do the same kind of thing also. Over time, they'll upgrade, extend, and build using cash and contract labor, all that. So they will go back to more or less what they did before, unless there's some intervention. And in that intervention, you start providing materials, cash, contract labor, and self-help and technical support. And this is where the building codes can come in. This is where you say that, yes, you do what you were doing before, but maybe spend that little extra rupee to make it a bit stronger. And so the other thing is also about recovery and self-recovery. I'm at the moment, right at this moment, doing a project on self-recovery in Vanuatu, a neighboring country. And this is supported by CARE. And in this particular project, what they had found out is that many agencies go and build housing for people and do all kinds of things, but people eventually are not satisfied. Things are not up to what they wanted. And agencies also have their limitations in terms of resources, time, etc. And so it never matches them. So there have been so many programs implemented throughout the world after disasters, and many of them, met criticism. So, and what had happened also is that one of my former students from Bangladesh, she did a study after a big cyclone in Bangladesh, and in 2007, Cyclone Sidir. By the time the NGOs and other organizations went there, almost 60% of the people had done some sort of self-recovery, not building back better, of course, but they had recovered. They were not lying on the ground and under the tree, but they had started salvaging materials, trying to get resources and getting back, getting their homes back. So this self-recovery process is very important. Agencies now, like agencies like CARE and others, the shelter clusters throughout the world, they have started supporting this self-recovery process instead of building houses. Cost effective, not so demanding, because building a house can be one of the most expensive things that an NGO can ever do. Most NGOs involve themselves in service delivery programs and not provision of assets like housing. So this kind of helps and kind of supports the people's own initiatives, but they come in at a juncture and say, at this point, build back safer and use the building codes and follow some of the safety features, the safe building codes. So that is the opportunity. So at this point is the time when we can have the intersection between the building codes and the recovery process, and then eventually go back to your housing in this no longer shelter. The other one is so this leads to the difference with the product versus process approach. And this I also mentioned to you about the building codes area, that it's, what we did was not a product approach, but it's a process approach. And within that, the product approach, you can have a tent, you can provide containers, you can provide a house in different stages of the project, emergency, transitional, permanent housing, but all of them are actually quite capital intensive. A tent in Nepal or Bangladesh or any of our South Asian countries, it's very expensive. Most people can't afford them, and many organizations, they have to transport them from overseas. There's embodied cost of energy and all that, and they're never satisfactory. They barely keep out the rain and the sun and the heat and the cold and all that. So and these kind of containers, even now in Australia and countries, developed countries like Australia, people are providing containers, shipping containers and caravans. We had a very large bushfire in 2020, 2020, and very large floods this year. And so people have been provided these, but how do they exit from there to go to this? That next step, the strategy, it's always missing. So it's a very different one when you start thinking of a product approach. Then the process approach suffers. So the process approach is a bit different. You start providing them support, giving them some money where they need some basic cash transfers, guidance through illustrated training handbooks, and materials, tools. Many of these organizations now provide what is called a shelter kit. And you can see, like this photograph from Indonesia, is that this is a woman. She has got a lot of those stuff, and she could manage to get her livelihood back just selling some basic food from her home. So yeah, so basically it's just a little anecdote that you cannot fix a door to a tent. So you have to be contextual. We have to understand where the problem lies and what needs to be done. It's not like just providing housing to everyone, the one size fits all approach, but the diversity, the multitudinalness of the context. So going back to what I discussed, the emergency transitional shelter issues, that photograph, I took that photograph in Haiti in 2013, 3 years after the large earthquake there, when all these kind of projects were built. The whole NGO community, global NGO community descended on Haiti. Who wasn't there? Everyone was there. And so they were providing initially they had provided these kind of tents, And you can see these tent materials have been draped around these transitional shelters. But I don't have, I cannot show a photograph here. I didn't have in this presentation, but these areas, they had consolidated and they had become urban slums. And the reason why is that they also didn't have any kind of services in terms of waste management and drainage and all that. So very unsanitary conditions started developing. People were dumping garbage all around the place, and they were getting waterlogged and floods. But there was no way that they could get rid of these people, because the leap from the transitional shelter to the permanent house was far-fetched. When will it happen, and what were the resources for it? So I think my good friend and Ahmed knows him, David Sanderson, he's written a very nice article. He said, lost in transition. So that is what has happened in many of these countries. So this idea of transitional shelter, and I think you may have equivalent experiences in Nepal as well. So essentially, NGOs and organizations, humanitarian agencies, they try to see it. Many of them, they have moved away from it now to some extent. But these 3 stages, you provide tents, emergency shelter, and then the transitional shelter that can go on. And then finally you go to the permanent house. These are photographs taken from Sri Lanka. And as you can see, the same kind of thing, that they've draped the transitional shelter with the emergency shelter materials. Nothing gets wasted in these countries. And these transitional shelters, I took these photographs almost 5 years after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and people were still living in there with no recourse of actually going to that. Very limited amount of houses were built to that standard and provided to people. So it's a long process, this kind of trajectory from disasters to recovery. It can take months to years. And so there are all kinds of temporary shelter approaches, and there are many, as I mentioned, in Australia, they're providing caravans. Some people are given vouchers to stay in hotels, but in the poor countries, they cannot get those kind of opportunities. And so they get these in situ temporary shelters or congregate temporary shelters, like that school in Bangladesh, which was converted into a temporary shelter after a very large flood in 2004. And people lived in that facility conversion as well, not congregate, I'm sorry, but this is the facility conversion that the school was converted. So the school kids couldn't go back to their school, and these people couldn't go back to their homes, and they just kept on staying there for very, very long periods of time. So I'll give you some very quick case studies. The first one is from Yogyakarta in Indonesia. This is a transitional shelter program, but transitional shelter need not be bad if it's thought about quite carefully. And so in this particular one, after the Yogyakarta earthquake 2006, what they decided is to provide transitional shelter, which can be gradually upgraded over time into a permanent shelter. So you can see that they'd built only the lower part of the wall. The upper walls were provided out of local materials, bamboo and other things. This bamboo was also very well built, treated, so it would last over long term in case they cannot make the transition to permanent housing. They salvaged a lot of the roofing tiles and provide the remaining ones, and they built these transition shelters. Many organizations, they did, IOM, IFRC, and so on. And this was also led by students from Gajah Mada University. Many of them were volunteers. They went and worked with the communities, did hands-on work for themselves. So this is a great idea. And again, the basic idea is that these transitional shelters, they would be scrapped and they would live in permanent housing. That turned out to be false, because nothing is wasted in the society. In this particular photograph, you see the transitional shelter had been retained, and the grandma, she lives in that transitional shelter. So, and there is a permanent house that was built later on through funding from support from the government and resources from the house. Looking at developed country like Australia, they had what they call the temporary villages. This is a very uncommon idea, which was a great idea, but very capital intensive and difficult. Next month, I have a conference in Australia when I'm going to talk about and try to question some of my colleagues in the DRR organizations here, that why don't they build temporary housing villages? Now, in this particular idea, this was a sort of medium-term solution, and it was equipped with all kinds of resources. I'll show you some photographs and you know what I'm talking about. They had everything, dining halls, kitchens, even a pet holding area, and pets are very important to people in this part of the world. And so people could stay in these temporary villages close to their houses, and they could kind of supervise the rebuilding of their houses. And they also had a building advisory service and a center. The building advisory service was dissolved after the temporary shelter was temporary village rather ended. And so this kept the community together instead of all of them dispersing. In many countries in the Western world, people get fed up and they just go somewhere. The community kind of loses its cohesiveness. And then in certain cases, in one of the villages, there were 3 of them built in Whittlesea, Marysville, and Kinglake. The one in Marysville is retained as a school camp. Let me show you some photographs and you get an idea what I'm talking about. Here you can see the school camp. So it was kept. So these are very small little houses, as you can see. We call them granny flats. And granny flats is that you can build a very small house if you have a large backyard for your grandmother to live with you. But granny flats, they are just equipped with all kinds of things. It's a very small dwelling. And this is what they had built. And you can see the temporary shelter. It had an open area in between, and they also had the park. And they had a barbecue center, which was built again by students from Monash University. And you can see the building advisory service center, which was close by, and so on. They had the dining hall. So it was all equipped. And after 18 months, this was all dismantled and left. In this particular example, the photograph, this was completely dismantled because this was land leased from a farmer. But in this particular case, the second one in Marysville, they actually kept it and they allowed to function as a long-term school camp. So finally, we come back to housing and talk about housing recovery. I'm going to run out of time, Ahmed, so I'll just try to go a bit fast. And again, like I said, it's a long-term process. You have your day one, you have your initial relief, and we have these 2 main funding windows. One is the humanitarian funding window, which kicks in after the disasters, and then the development funding window, which may have been operating before. And then after about 6 or 7 months, the development funding window takes over, and then eventually that grows. But this can take 1 to 5 years, of course. And this is the diagram. Again, this is taken from a friend of mine from Australia. And what he had shown is that initially there's this feeling of altruism, and there's the honeymoon period. You think that, okay, I've survived the disaster, I've made it alive, my family is okay, and there are all these pledges by the government and others to help us and support us. And then the disappointment, anger, frustration, disputes, all that starts setting in with the red tape, and then you lose the support. You have problems with insurance, trying to claim money from them, and going back and forth. And then you get completely exhausted, and your cohesiveness, the groups, they fragment, and the delays go on 1 to 3, even 5 years, it continues. And then eventually you get to your reconstruction. So how can we kind of revert this curve so that it's the opposite? So this is a question that I pose to you. So basically, in this case, the housing recovery is we just kind of fix up things, we make things permanent. And basically, the main thing is to reduce future disaster risk. As you can see in this program, this is one of my favorite reconstruction programs in Sri Lanka, done by an organization called Foundation of Goodness, FOG. And what they had done, amazingly, is that they stayed within the community. They came into being as an organization. They have continued staying there and working with them, not a fly-in, fly-out humanitarian international NGO. But and what they had done, they decided to build 2-story houses simply because it's a duplex. So you can see the 2 different families living in the duplex, and you can see that it's because people were so scared after the tsunami that they had to elevate the building so that they get a sense of safety. Different approaches, the owner-driven approach. There's been a lot of talk about its merits. This is a community-driven, where the community works together, and of course, the agency-driven paradigm is widely prevalent as well. And I won't go into these in great detail because I will be running out of time if I do it. But you see that there are different ways. But one good thing is that the degree of control in the owner-driven approach is very high, and in the agency-driven approach is low in many cases. But the owner-driven approach, I don't want to romanticize it because it also has its disadvantages. It has got many advantages. Yes, they're satisfied with the eventual outcome, but there are many disadvantages. People have the money and they just spend it, or they might sell the materials that they get, and all kinds of stuff. Quality control, you need to supervise, and people may feel overwhelmed. They may not be able to participate in these projects, so they may not have the right skills, and so on. So a whole range of issues also come up. But of course, we will have to balance the advantage and disadvantage every time a decision is made to take to take an approach. And there could be approaches that combine the benefits of both. So you have a hybrid approach. This program is also by CARE in Sri Lanka. As you can see, that what they had done is that they had a certain design, but the households could go in and change the design to a little extent through consultations, and they could supervise the construction work. They could go and see, and this way all stakeholders could feel that they had some sort of ownership. In this photograph, you might have included photograph. Those fan lights were included by the homeowner, because they said that this brings in some light inside the house. This is what we wanted. So they could influence some of the design decisions. So the different levels of engagement in this owner-driven and community-driven processes. This is an example from Sri Lanka, again, UN Habitat, and they were given drawings, and then they were built by local construction workers. And again, they could adjust, the households could adjust it. Haiti, another one, earthquake resistant construction, they were given these details and designs, but they were built by local construction workers, and so they brought in some income in the community. IFRC in Bangladesh, again, they provided building materials and all that, and the designs were built by the houses. So you get different kinds of houses using the same kind of materials. And you look at, again, a developed country like the USA, then they started incorporating these elevated buildings because of the storm surge that followed hurricane Katrina. And so, yeah, so there are different approaches. But in this particular case, this is a very high profile, supported by the famous actor Brad Pitt, and where the world famous architects came and built all these. So, and they call it the Make It Right program. But many questions that it was actually made right. I probably won't have time to discuss in great detail, but let me just go on to the other project in Bangladesh, where I was a shelter consultant. More than 16,000 houses built after that very large flood I mentioned in 2004. And so they had, I will show you a small video clip that will tell you what the program was all about.
In the same way, in the family shelter or the house reconstruction program, we have tried to introduce techniques which would ensure risk reduction or make these houses less vulnerable to next floods.
Floods swallow up people's lives and livelihood. With their houses drowned, people take refuge on high roads, dams, or flood shelters. After the floods subside, a lot of them cannot find their houses since they have been washed away. To make sure that the houses of the people whose lives are already difficult do not get washed away by the floods, in various project areas model houses have been built. Risk reduction aspects of the model houses are cement stabilized earthen plinth, concrete footing, katla, bamboo treatment, and rainwater gutter. Treatment of bamboos is one of the distinguishing features of this project. This protects the bamboo from insect attack and rotting. For the footing of the bamboo posts, the katla is made through local initiative. A soil and cement combination in the ratio of 19:1 was used for capping the plinth of the house. This prevents the plinth from being washed away.
ঘরটা খুব সুন্দর হয়েছে বুঝছে ঘরটা বন্যা এলেও ভাঙবো না
rainwater gutter made of split PVC pipes are used to prevent rainwater falling from roof eaves and damaging the lower part of the house. It also provides an alternative supply of arsenic-free water for household use. 16,036 houses were built in 23 districts under the housing project for the flood-stricken people. The houses differ in shape and structure in different areas depending on the quality of soil and easy availability of the materials. In some areas, instead of katla and bamboo, concrete pillars made of rods and cement is used. Again, in some areas, instead of bamboo fences, metal sheet is used. No matter what material is used, it is made sure that the houses are resistant to flooding. Certain criteria is set before nominating the people who are eligible to get the houses. The chairman of Village Development Council plays an important role in this regard.
যাকে ঘরটা দেওয়া আছে তার ঘরটা ধুসে গেছে গা, তার ঘর তোলা কোনো সমর্থ নাই, সে বিধবা, তাকে আমার ঘরটা সমর্থন করিয়া তাকে নির্মাণ করে দেওয়া হইতেছে।
আমার স্বামী মারা যাওয়ার পরে আমি অনেক দুঃখ কষ্ট করছি। আমি একটা ঘর বেগরও থাকতে পাই নাই। আমার ভাইয়ের রান্নাঘরত থাকছি, থাকার পরে আর বছর একটা সোনের ঘর আছিল, ভাঙতে পরে বন্যা ভেঙে নিয়ে গেছে। সবাই মিলে আমাকে একটা ঘর দিছে। আমি কোনোদিনও ভাবিনি যে আমার এত সুন্দর একটা ঘর হবে।
Right, just to give you an idea of this project, and this is the kind of stuff. Look, the houses that you saw, they can be fairly modest, but if you understand the context, this is how people were living after the flood. And yes, you may call this self-recovery, but this was the condition. And then this is what, so you can see that even though it's a modest house, it's definitely a leap from the previous conditions that people were living. Here you can see this is a typical house that they would be living in, and the one on the right is one of the houses built by the program. And again, not following a one-size-fits-all approach. And in this particular project, what we did was we provided specifications of the certain kinds of materials, but they could have their own design, their own ideas, the kind of houses tuned to the different localities, locations, the areas, so that they use local resources and in tune to the local environment. And then the idea of flexibility, that they could have variations, they could use materials as they chose. Some people wanted to use concrete posts, as you can see, instead of the short concrete stumps that we provided, and so on. So you can see the variation and the variety. And yes, that's what I meant. They instead of treating bamboo with the kind of ideas that we gave, we didn't use any toxic chemicals also, just use local oils. But here they just got sap from a certain kind of tree, which is local in the area, that helped protect the bamboo for that matter. So you see, and they introduced cross bracing in certain areas because of the strong wind in that particular location. So, and this kind of project, 16,000 houses, it generated employment for a large number of people who worked on the sites, building material suppliers, transports of, people who are supplying materials from one side to the other. So there's a lot of potential, like any other thing, that it has got its problems and its potential. And I won't go into the great detail. Cost effectiveness, they can build in local context, can be easily replicated in our training. But on the other hand, there are many problems in the beneficiary selection process, and also the project planning, and some of the NGOs were also not very honest. And the quality control issues, this always very important, needs local capacity building. But this project also had a very long-term impact, and I had written about it in my community engagement post-disaster recovery book, which I showed you earlier, that some of the partner NGOs, they started using some of these ideas, and they had replicated some of those ideas in their training handbooks. And here you can see the treatment of bamboo process, that they drill a very small hole and they pour local oils into it. It could be anything, diesel, kerosene, whatever. And they were doing it in the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh, and also after 2007. So, and now things have changed. This project was done in 2005, and now Bangladesh has developed more. There are more brick buildings, larger houses, and all kinds of stuff. So when I went back to one of these areas just quite recently, I found that they had those smaller houses had gone, and they had built very, very large houses. But they had used some of those materials, and they salvaged some of the materials. And in fact, that particular juncture in time, when they got that support, helped them stabilize. Otherwise, they would be in a floating condition, help them stabilize to move on to long-term prosperity. So I can give you another example, Cyclone Isla, 2009. And this was done again by my colleagues from Brack University, which Ahmed mentioned right at the beginning. And so in this particular case, it was a reconstruction project in southern Bangladesh after the cyclone and inundation for more than 2 years because of the storm surge. And so this was an agency-driven and owner-driven kind of hybrid approach. And so the houses again were elevated because they had the trauma of the storm surge, even though they filled in at the bottom, but the living quarter was upstairs. And they had a whole range of things, their livelihoods, infrastructure, education, all that together integrated in the project. And here you can see the architecture students working with the local community members in developing house designs, which were appropriate for them. So you can see some of them, they're actually working on the ground. This is the main architect, Kabir, who worked on this project. And this is the school that was built. So it's not just building houses, but it's a large community. And you can see that some of these houses that extended over time as well. If you go back, people have been investing. They had made all these homestead gardens and planted trees and made it much more habitable. So once people get an initial support, then they maximize it and start investing on their own and making these wonderful environments. And nothing really happens without the community. The community is the most important central part in efforts such as this. So let me go into your part of the world, looking at Gorkha earthquakes, Nepal recovery. This is an article that we had written very soon after we came back to 2017. And I won't go into the great detail of it. It was also written by Haridarshan Shrestha, who joined us in writing this. And what we had found is that there were just all kinds of problems, even 30 months after the earthquakes. Only 12% of the 400,000 houses that were rebuilt, and the 4.4 billion of international aid that came in, very little had been dispersed. And so there were all kinds of problems. And also the payments were dependent on the compliance of the building codes. And people who didn't have land, they could not access these programs as well. And you are more familiar with these than I am, so I won't go into great detail. This is also featured in our Disaster Resilience in South Asia book, drawn from the report some of our colleagues from Tribhuvan University gave us. And so these are some of the key issues. First is awareness. And this is something which Ahmed and his team from NCD have been battling with for a very, very long time. Building awareness, the Earthquake Safety Day, and different perceptions on the NBCs at different levels. And then the training and quality improvement initiative. There have been many taken like on board. The NBC training for engineers, trade persons have been done by the government, homeowner counseling in certain municipalities. I think it was also done in Lalitpur, as one of the colleagues pointed out earlier. And then the women's cooperatives, where they could also take part in the construction work. But there was also this changing labor market. Many of the people went off to the Middle East because they had more jobs there, so there weren't enough people to do, or skilled people to do the work, so the skilled drain. And yet people were getting a lot of money because there's all this reconstruction work going on, so there was a demand for people. And so rural-urban disparity, and I think Ahmed will talk a little bit about it after we talk that, whether the building codes and the reconstruction program was more successful in the rural areas or not. And then the institutional behavior. There was this one side that NBC or the Reconstruction Authority, it was seen as having a very big stake in controlling, and they said that you have to follow this. You can't get the money in installments without fulfilling milestones. And so there was this kind of controlling approach. But on the other hand, they were also considered that if that doesn't happen, then people will not be following it. So that is necessary. So there are different viewpoints about that kind of approach. And then the reconstruction financing, insurance, land tenure, resettlement, all these issues start kicking in. and also the equity issues. And as I mentioned, people without land, they were not able to access some of these programs. Dalits, the lower caste people were often deprived. So perhaps these anecdotes will be more forthcoming from your end when we have a discussion. So looking at some other countries, Indonesia, again, looking at long-term issues, this is what happens. The government in this particular case, they had a one-size-fits-all approach, a 36 square meter house, and everyone was given the same kind of house, but people very soon started extending. And you can see this photo drawing that this is the house that was originally built in gray, and the red color is the extensions that they built, it almost double. Here you can see in this photograph as well, this was the original house built by a humanitarian agency, and this was the extension done by the house, far exceeding the original house. And people were filling in the lower part and doing all kinds of construction. There were cultural issues also. The agency envisioned them to have a kind of westernized idea of having a toilet inside the house, but they kind of demolished those toilets and converted them because they have two different bathrooms. One, because this is water usually from wells outside. So they have a pure area and a and not so pure, a polluted area. The polluted area is the bathroom where they, the toilet rather, where they have a different tank, where the washroom has a different tank, especially because also perform ablutions for prayers. So there were cultural factors involved in this kind of, issue. Looking at the Maldives, very similar, one-size-fits-all approach was done in this particular project that we look at in Tuvalu Island, a safe island program. And so people needed extra space for fish processing, and they had to do all kinds of things. They had to have livelihoods, so they extended the front and converted them into small restaurants. This one became a two-story house from what the original house was. This was actually, you can see the original house there in the back. All kinds of issues. They just waste management issues come in, environmental issues come in. People wanted jobs. They couldn't live on that island, so they moved. So they're just very big issues. It's not only just building houses, but dealing with the whole gamut of issues that needs to be addressed in an integrated way. India, and again, long-term issues. The government, under the guise of the so-called Slum Clearance Board, they cleared up all the slums, which are small shanty towns of fisher folk living on the coast. They got them to move inland and cleared up that land, and they gave these multi-story walk-ups, 4-story walk-ups, and very small apartments, 22 square meters, one room. As you can see, this is what it is, with just a small toilet and a kitchen alcove. How can people live, and especially when they have large families? So they started having all kinds of problems here. Construction quality, again, quality control is a very big issue. You can see the poor quality of construction that became apparent. And people needed livelihoods, employment, and so there are all kinds of things. So many of these houses eventually sold, and people went back to their coastal locations and built shanties. So giving you an overview of that, just to try to kind of capture it all, the key elements of effective reconstruction. One is integration of housing with community infrastructure. I've talked about integration quite a bit. Livelihoods, very important, and especially the local economy, injecting funds into the local economy through the reconstruction process. Sustained engagement, I talked to you about the Foundation of Goodness. Here's a photograph from one of the projects with the Foundation of Goodness, where the agency decided to support the community over a very long time, multi-stakeholder engagement, different ideas, different groups, different people coming in and doing things, each bringing in their own specific contributions, but at the same time, differing aspirations that need to be negotiated. Built environmental professionals, they need to come in and give the technical support. As the community had been doing things for a very long time, but at this point, there needs to be a synthesis of external technical know-how with the local indigenous knowledge bank. And then how do you implement in difficult contexts, very far, remote areas, the hilly mountainous terrain in rural Nepal, how do you actually implement it? So these kind of issues need to be taken into consideration. And once that is done, then you have your effective reconstruction. And I think of paramount importance is the building back better and safer part. That is where your building codes come in, and just adding a little bit of an extra element, a safety feature, raising the house above the water level, having an extra cross spacings, all that matter. And the post-disaster reconstruction, as I said, opens up this window of opportunity to incorporate building codes and do things better than they were before. Another very short video clip, if I may.
In the aftermath of a disaster, a robust recovery plan that puts the needs of communities first will ensure minimal disruption and save lives. Pre-assigning resources and operational tasks before a disaster takes place will ensure that reconstruction can begin as soon as possible. Community needs following a disaster must be immediately attended to. Clearing stricken areas provides an opportunity for thorough reassessment of risks and to build back better and more resilient. Integrating disaster risk reduction and community improvement measures into the rebuilding process helps communities in the short term, as well as reducing future vulnerabilities. Together, we're building a more resilient world.
Right, so I think I will stop here. Dhanyabad, thank you so for your patience, and I think I've really stretched my time limits. So Ahmed, over to you for Q&A.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can you please remove the, or let it be there. Then never mind.
I can share.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful overview, and that was a wonderful excursion. I would say, almost to all continents. I never knew that you had such a wonderful experience everywhere virtually, and then more specifically in South Asia. So that provided a very wider overview. I have several questions to you and some proposition also, but then let me open the floor to question from the audience. So the floor is open. Everybody is invited to put forward their questions. There was a question in chat box, but then unfortunately Ayush had to leave, and then I never knew that the question disappears from the chat box if somebody leaves. I didn't know that, but if I'm wrong, then maybe Umazi, you can write, if it's still there, Ayush question, then you can write it down, because I lost internet connection in between for some time. So so that may be the reason that I lost the question. So do you have a question in the chat box? Do you see any question in the chat box?
No, I didn't see any. I saw a comment who, the gentleman who mentioned that it was Lalitpur. That's about as far as I know.
Okay. I don't know. No. Okay, I wrote him to him. I mean, I just had to leave. So, कुमारजी के छ यो chat box मा छैन है के question?
Question चाहिँ छैन chat box मा.
Okay, ल question चाहिँ नि यो जो अहिले हुनुहुन्छ जति चाहिँ पार्टिसिपेन्ट हुनुहुन्छ उहाँहरुको के क्वेशन छ भन्दाखेरि क्वेशन गरौँ. उहाँहरु चाहिँ हात उठाउनुहोस् र चाहिँ नि कुमारजी मलाई चाहिँ मद्दत गर्नुहोस्. कसैले क्वेशन गरेको हात उठाउनु भएको मैले नदेखेको हुन सक्छ. त्यसकारण चाहिँ नि मलाई मद्दत गर्नु होला. But then
I see there's a question that has come up from Rupesh Shrestha.
Yes. Okay. Please.
So may I answer that? Are there building codes in Bangladesh specifically addresses flood resilience? No. No, they don't. And I can say that to you directly, because again, the preoccupation of the building codes, and they have been revised, and perhaps the latest version may have something, but I doubt it. They are kind of influenced by what is happening around them in the region, and also by some professionals. Some of them Ahmed knows quite well, Jamila Reza Chaudhry, who focus a lot on earthquakes. And so, yes, but there's nothing on. And remember that the flooding issue is not only the building codes, it's also the planning regulations. Right. Where you build. If you're going to build in a flooding area, floodplain area, then you're going to get flooded, whatever you build. And even if you have your building, you're marooned, you cannot go out of your house. You need a boat to go anywhere. But what they are doing in cities, they're just filling up land and building, building, building. And they are disrupting the natural hydrological flow by doing that. And there were many large fish ponds in the city. They have all been filled in. So where can the water go? There isn't enough drainage. So now instead of flooding, we have a waterlogging problem. And so no, there are no codes for that. They have standards for drainage and all that, but again, that is not part of the building codes, unfortunately not. And when you hear about Bangladesh, you only hear about the flooding. It's one of the most important hazards, most significant hazards in Bangladesh, and yet the building codes don't really touch on it. A lot of the focus of the building codes in these countries is on setbacks and kind of design issues of accessibility. This is enough ground area coverage, and there's a lift in place, and so on. So, and even enforcing those minimal requirements is very difficult. So, sorry, Rupesh, I couldn't give you a good answer.
No, actually, if the planning bylaws, they are the sources for, they are the sort of a background for revenue generation, because they're the municipality can police very well, but then making the building strength stronger, or earthquake resistant or disaster resistant, that is it's very difficult to build into the building permit process. Okay, and not everybody has got the skill. So incidentally, it so happened that the National Building Code of Bangladesh and National Building Code of Nepal, it was almost a parallel event. It was a parallel event, and while those who took part mostly, apart from the government, outside the government, it was NSET in this country, Nepal, and it was Bangladesh Earthquake Society in Bangladesh. So both were a little bit earthquake centric. But then I'm also surprised that I think that, if correct me if I'm wrong, 60% of the territory of Bangladesh is inundated during the flood, but still you don't have the building code. But but then, well, that is not having a building code is not a big crime, but actually not complying to the building code is a crime. It's not good. Are there any other question? You can raise hands also. Otherwise, I have certain questions.
I think there's a question from Sham Khimeri.
Okay, Sham Khimeri, please, can you put your question yourself?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for giving me time. Just I'm trying to know, definitely there is no building code set in this, especially in the South Asian countries, especially Nepal, Bangladesh, and these things. And you can't correlate the building code in the Western world and the Asian country like our country. I'm not biased in that sense, but is there any similarity in the sense of the standard, minimum standard? For example, I saw that some photograph and video presented these houses was built on the consideration of the financial support or donation from the foreign government or foreign aid. From the photograph, these building, these houses are not somewhere not very standard to say houses. So how it works? So while the donor or international agency give money to the local government or local agency, do they have certain like the term of contract or a standard agreement or certain level of quality need to be maintained for this habitat?
Before you answer, Sam, can you identify yourself, where you work or what is your background?
I think I spoke with you the same seminar last week. I live in Sydney. My background is geotechnical and engineering.
Wonderful. Well, no, it's not only for me, but for the entire audience.
Oh, sorry, it's my apology.
Nice. Okay, good.
No, that is a great question. I think you're referring to that first video, and I wanted to provoke you by showing that video, the sandbag, earth bag concept that the Global Earth Group was building in Nepal. And of course, it is not compliant with your NBC. That is for sure. And the other problem is that how can they actually go ahead and build those houses? And this was done after the Gurkha earthquake in the reconstruction process. So I think these organizations, they come in, they bring in their own ideas and they do their own things and they can get away with it. And particularly countries like our countries, Bangladesh, Nepal, all these countries, these are poor countries. The governance structure is weak and they take advantage of, kind of promoting their projects. They would never be able to build some of those in their own countries because of all the legislative aspects. So, but they can go ahead and do it in countries like that and experiment. So I think that is unfortunate, even though they may have great merits, but that has to go through a process of review, consultation, and understanding how they can be actually inserted within the context without just going ahead and doing it. So I am very critical of that kind of thing. So Sham, you are very right to point that out.
Okay.
Can I add just quickly, sorry, short tail question. Like, having said that, is that not the opportunity, for example, a big earthquake or flooding in the country like us, when we had such event, it is not the opportunity to drag or to to facilitate to make the building code or minimum standard to the authorities. Okay, this is the opportunity, this is the time, looking forward, let's do it. This is not the right approach, or why our agencies, NGOs, and working organizations is not forcing in that direction?
I think, Ahmed, you can answer this better because your context, you know it quite well. I think there is some work being done in Nepal after the earthquakes, not everywhere, but where they have been trying to implement the building codes. But again, there are challenges, of course.
Actually, let me join in here before I give the opportunity of questioning to Upendra Baraji. See, and building code implementation is a big challenge that we have to agree. And it seems that while earlier there were two apprehensions. One is that we don't have the capacity. The other apprehension was that it is way too expensive for us to afford it. But NSET, since 2009, after the Pakistan earthquake, actually, by the way, NSET was born for helping the government and the community for building code implementation. That was the numero uno objective of NSET. So after we had organized approaches. Now the achievement is phenomenal. 50 municipalities, unfortunately not Kathmandu, not Lalitpur, Lalitpur doesn't have so much of, still, I mean, it's a pioneer, but it is the achievement is not as sparking as in some of the others, like Dharan and Byas and others. There has been a wonderful achievement in terms of building code compliance. Now, starting from about 10 to 15% of code compliance in drawing as well as on site, the compliance rate for a mix of the engineered and non-engineered building has risen up to almost like 90%. So this is phenomenal, and it has been published. I mean, the World Conference in Earthquake Engineering in Chile, or subsequently perhaps now for the Tokyo conference also, you can get papers on that. So it is a phenomenal success in terms of, but still there are many problems. The earthquake reconstruction is basically, it's a huge opportunity for enhancing this culture of compliance, which we have achieved largely. I must tell you that is 1 million households that has been, at least the government claims that these are all made to building code standards, okay, and these are owner-driven approaches. I mean, one can ask a lot of questions about owner-driven approaches, whether, and you talked about that one size doesn't fit all, and we have a tremendous problem in terms of how do we define that owner-driven reconstruction, and what was done in Nepal. Was that actually the owner-driven reconstruction as defined theoretically, or it was something like a Nepali version of an owner-driven approach with losses of some of the cultural identities of the settlements and many other problems like that. So I don't know whether I answered Saraji Gimiriji's question, But then let's not. I mean, I'm prepared to enter into a discussion, and which is one of my proposal now. But let us listen to Upendra Baralji. Upendra Baralji, if you are there, could you please first briefly identify yourself for the purpose of the, so that the audience know you well, and then put up your question. Upendra Baralji, are you there?
I think his microphone is not working. That's what he's saying. So he says he works in the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing.
Wonderful, wonderful. So you can read the question if they.
Yeah, I can. It's a long question, and I think I'll summarize it. What he has tried to say is that Nepal has a very unique topographical situation, and the distance from sea level and so on. So the building codes need to be very specific for a context like that, and so his question is that it's more of a comment, and I think it says the Kathmandu Valley, wide range of subsurface lithography. So the code needs to be varied according to the different parts of the country, and they have to be like adapted, I believe, what he's saying to the different local micro environmental conditions. Perhaps I've interpreted it. I think it's more of a comment than a question.
Okay, but there is a question, underlying question there, and I have confronted with that question very much. Now, and many of the municipalities also in Nepal, I'm just sort of polishing, if you allow me to say like that, I'm polishing Upendra Paral's question. See, there is a national building code which was constructed or it has written in Nepal after a long process, long consultative process, which essentially defines the the acceptable level of risk. And like many countries, it is similar to many other countries in terms of the and it was very much influenced by Australia and New Zealand code. Now the question is, many municipalities, they say that the national building code was designed in Kathmandu, Nepal, in Singhdarbar, the office. But in our case, we cannot afford it. We cannot have, our geophysical situation are different. So there should be several national building code, or there should be several building code. Write our own code for every municipality. So that has been a little bit with a political also, political also angle, that why should we follow the, what has been designed in Kathmandu? Why should not we have our own sort of a thing? And in our case, what is defined in the act or everywhere is that this is the minimum standard, and you can add on your own specific context locally. That's what it is. You may want to comment on that. How do you think the ideal situation could be?
Well, look, what we have are two different paradigms. One is what we call the prescriptive building codes, and the other one is the performance building codes, performance-based building codes. Now, the prescriptive building codes are like you have to follow what's written in the book, and this is exactly what you have to do. And that is not very flexible, of course, and but that kind of allows you to enforce it. It allows you to, measure the outcomes. On the other hand, the performance basis, you adapt to the local conditions. You facilitate certain changes and adaptations according to the context, which is what I think our friend Upendra was trying to get at. But I think the performance building codes now, they have been embraced even in countries like Australia. Is that, like you said, Ahmed, that they would have a minimum standard. You cannot fulfill it, and that would go back to your safety features, and you cannot build unsafe buildings. But beyond that, some of the other things, it could be according to your context. You could kind of adapt to it, and you could justify it according to that. So when we have a builder here, for example, say, I'm just giving a slightly different example, they have environmental building codes. They have to follow certain environmental regulations in terms of sustainability, according to the color of the building and the kind of quality of materials they use. Now, the builder can argue that this particular area, it is a cool area, and hence we don't have to follow certain things. this area is a very hot area, we have to follow certain things. So they can argue for those and relax some of those codes, and they would have to apply for it from the council and get approval for it. So there's that little bit of process of negotiation allowed. But the safety aspects, they should not compromise, of course, and particularly in areas which are very, very high risk, Nepal with its earthquakes. I think you're right to prioritize on the earthquake issues. Of course, you also have landslides and flooding in certain areas. And as our friend also mentioned, that there are very different, environmental conditions. The terrain is quite different from the upper highlands, for example. Would the same building codes apply there? Is it an earthquake risk area? Is the micro-zonation done for earthquake risk in these areas? So these are very big questions. I think they need a lot of resources for that kind of analysis and research to be able to inform policy and practice. So I think countries like Nepal are often strapped for those kind of resources, not only financial, but also human resources and capacity at institutions and organizations to be able to engage in that kind of work in a very transparent and accountable way. So I think given that, but those questions are still pertinent, very important to understand, the diversity of conditions and how the prescriptive building codes can have a more performance-based approach.
Yes.
I think our friend Sham also wanted to add something else. He's got this. Let's Sham, go for it.
Okay, just quick. Yeah, sorry about dominating the question.
No, go for it.
Can you hold on? Hold on, Sam. Can you hold on?
Sure.
Just to add on, add on that we had a revision of the building code recently. Unfortunately, some of the elements that was called for example, the problem of even for the earthquake code, the problem of liquefaction in Tarai is way high than in the mountain region, for example. Okay, although there are some in the valleys, there are some cases of this thing. But then rather than looking into the building code on that wider perspective, the building code revision act was contracted out a consultant, you understand, or a team of consultants, and sort of it didn't evolve. Rather than it was the consultants were good, they were educated, they were very, very knowledgeable person. But then rather than evolving it as it should have been, it was sort of again made or customized and then perhaps included, and that has perhaps alienated this ownership of the building code from the because majority of them are the non-engineered buildings. It is the owner, household who design and made it themselves. So there are problems, and then the problem that I see is that the culture of building code compliance is still to be strengthened in our part of the world. It's not only it's not only the technical issue, it is more of a social and psychological issue. That aspect nobody has worked upon. I stop here and give the very quickly, Sam, let's not dominate. Let's allow others also.
Sure. Just quickly, what I'm trying to add with Dr. Ahmed explanation regarding the building code in Australia, as I am also practicing the urban geotechnique. Probably for the residential, especially in urban development, probably there are more than 10 Australian standards which are accumulated under the single umbrella of the building code. So for example, if we are building the one single story house, probably the engineers or the developer have to follow the minimum 10 Australian standard until from the foundation to the roof. So, but this standard, there is some flexibility is given on the state by state or council by council, what the minimum you have to do it, and what is the, what are the maximum you must do it. So these fundamental things are under the certain, a different standard for different aspect of the work. I'm just trying to go a little bit another question to Dr. Dixit. Why, my question is, you have done very, very good job in the earthquake sector last 30 years. Why there is no such a thing, other people, other group of people can't do that level of the detailed work to make the building code more strengthened and more regulatory?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I mean, the question should be directed to Ifte, but if you are asking me the question,
No, it's all right.
no, Ifte. The problem is, at this time when I should be celebrating the success, of my 30 years, almost 30 years of devotion into this field, now I am in a situation that I sometimes think that, with despite all these achievements and everything, the condition now for me to work is very, very bad. Very, very bad, because of so many different reasons. I mean, Nepalese and outside Nepalese, I feel many times, it is getting much more and more difficult for any specialist to work in Nepal, in terms of, because that's why this series of webinar is there, because you know very much of a silo effect, very much of a individual, this institutional, ownership, but not a Nepalese or national ownership is there. The programs are very much short-lived, but then the sustainability of the program is very little. So I mean, I should have been celebrating a lot, but then I must say that I'm not pessimistic, but still. So I don't know. I don't know. I mean, we also don't have the flood code. And even for the earthquake, we don't have the building code. We don't have the code for bridges. And you can see that, one instance of a heavy flood, it has washed away most of the cardinal bridges in Nepal. That was the 1953 flood in South Central Nepal. So we have got the problems. But then the things are not inclusive. So Samji, people like you are stalwarts. You talked about wonderful things about Australia, but then I would suggest you to translate your experience of Australia and contextualize in Nepal, and let us make a case, which I'm going to propose. For example, we had this reconstruction. We had this reconstruction. Everybody talked about transitional, but I feel that we essentially didn't have any transitional. And when I mean transitional, it is not it's not something that we demolish, but can we build upon the transitional shelter into a permanent shelter? We in Pakistan, when NSET was working, we were thinking about, considering the stone masonry buildings, we were thinking about, the possibility of horizontal expansion, starting from one room house as a temporary shelter or as emergency shelter, which people can do, and then toilet outside, and then the kitchen in the same room, this thing, and starting from one room, lateral expansion and vertical expansion over the time. First lateral expansion and then vertical expansion. So that we tried, but we miserably failed, because there was no acceptability to that, especially when the foreign, I had to struggle a lot with this prefabricated, a lot of companies, helicopter in there, and then they were started, propagating for the what do you call the pre cast, elements, and then we making the building. So this culture is not there. Perhaps something needs to be done in transitional sector. That is my question to you. But then the other question is, if they, and we don't have much time, other question for me is that, do you have students, Nepali students in your program? And if there are, that's very good. But can there be? Do you see the potential of any scientific collaboration with non-students but young scientists of Nepal? So possibility or avenues for collaboration with the early career scientists and this thing, because they are the future, they are the strong, they have got they may be a little bit shy, they may not talk out a little bit louder, but then they are the real property of the country. So do you think that it is possible to have any program, scientific program, we can have an audit of the owner driven approach or community driven approach? To what extent it was owner driven, to what extent it was government driven, this our own, the Gorkha earthquake reconstruction, to what extent it was agency driven, because there were agencies also. and what are the benefits and contribution of each of these things. So some area like this could be the object of research, and please see if there are any avenues for some research, and we will be very happy. Geological Society will be very happy to facilitate. Not necessarily that we should do it ourselves, but then we'll facilitate any congregation of such, with your your academia and local academia, or Tiruvallur University or Kathmandu University, or our, if one of the organizers is the Universal Engineering Science College, and the young scientists or young students here.
Great. Look, many thoughts, many ideas. I think we will definitely explore opportunities for collaboration. At the moment, I don't have any Nepalese PhD students, but I do have a student in our master's program, Shilpa Odhikari, who is doing her master's in disaster and sustainable development. She's very, very active. I had former colleagues in my previous job at RMIT, Prem Chetri, professor now, who is originally from Nepal, and he's been doing a lot of work in the area of supply chain and logistics in disaster area. So I think there are opportunities. We can forge together a partnership. I haven't explored, but we have many Nepalese students. And so I think there are more questions coming in. I don't think we will have time. I think there are very large questions. So one thing I just want to very quickly touch on what Sham had been touching on. Remember, right at the beginning, I said that there are planning regulations, building bylaws, and land use planning issues which intersect with building codes. If you're going to, and this is, everything is not great in Australia as well. I mean, when we had the massive floods here this year, and people said that why were people allowed to build in the floodplains? What is going on there? And then if people are going to live in the bush and they're going to get affected with the bushfires, why are people actually allowed to build housing when they know that those places are at high risk? So there are questions here as well. And that comes back to your land use planning issues. And so I think I will leave it there because it's a very big discussion that we need to have. I think Rupesh has a very quick question, perhaps regarding short-lived projects, humanitarian development sector, targeted more in rural areas. Indeed, made post-construction a 5-year project. Have urban housing construction. There was less progress compared to urban in Nepal. Do you think there's an urban bias all over the world? How to change the project working? Yeah, well, Nepal, I think very true. And because the predominant focus is on earthquakes here, and which is why a lot of the focus was on urban areas, rural areas, and I mentioned that this is part of our research finding. The rural areas, they face kind of disparity, and this is typical all over the world. But interestingly, in certain countries, because the urban sector, particularly when we're talking about the urban poor, they live in settlements which are not recognized by the government. They don't have formal land tenure, which is why the humanitarian actors do not engage in such areas. And in the rural areas, when they will have some sort of ownership, they feel more relaxed in being able to operate there. Even now, the project I mentioned to you in Vanuatu, in the main capital city, Port Vila, nothing. Very difficult in the informal settlements, but they're happy to work in the outer-lying islands where things are easier. So there are pros and cons on both sides.
Good. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was Rupesh's question, and perhaps he was a little bit worried about why the progress of urban reconstruction was way less than that of rural reconstruction. But that's an issue. That's an issue that we can discuss. Unfortunately, we have now it is almost like 16:03, and still some formalities have to be done. So let us stop here, and thank you very much, Iftekhar. That was a wonderful thing, and you talked about it was a. I was amazed by your, the scope of your coverage. You talked about reconstruction and building code compliance virtually everywhere, and also zeroed in on Nepal and Bangladesh. That was very illuminating, and perhaps many people like that. Many people like this, and it was a good success. So I see that I would like to now hand it over to Kumar Kharkaji, our General Secretary of the Nepal Geological Society. Perhaps he has something to say. Kumarji, over to you, please.
Thank you, sir. And thank you to the Professor Ahmed for your wonderful presentation. And now I'd like to request all our participants to open your video so we can take our photographs. And then I would like also request our president, if there is anything to say, I would like to request him to say something at last.
Please share the photo, huh?
Sure. We'll share the photo. But then where is the photograph? Somebody is taking photograph?
I will take one from my end.
I also think.
So, well, thank you, Kumar. If the photographs are taken, I would like to thank Dr. Iftekhar Ahmed for his excellent presentations. It was really wonderful. I was really amazed by the way he framed the presentation and presented. It was really wonderful for me, and I learned a lot today. And I hope all the participants who are here, they too have got some ideas on all these aspects of disaster resilience and response and the building code things. And I think the people who are well related with this, our seismology department and other building departments and all, will be highly, they will be privileged to use all these research in their day-to-day work, and I think we'll get be enlightened with all this work again. And thanking you again, Dr. Iftekhar, and also thanking all the participants, and finally our secretary. And I adjourn this meeting from now on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes. Could you take the photograph, please? Please share it. It's on. Otherwise, I can request you to please switch on your camera again, and I'll take one from my end. Is that all right?
No. We can do either ways, but we'll definitely share with you whatever we have.
Thank you very much.
But then my question, my request is that, I will encourage our young guys to contact you and to learn from you.
Yeah, definitely.
So
definitely.
That I'm going to encourage, and so that there should be a continuous process of if there any opportunity for doing any research on this thing with your expertise and with the young energy that we have, perhaps we have to look into, especially with respect to a little bit of a geological angle, a little bit of a the soil and the geomorphology and geology. This angle has never been used for the reconstruction. Perhaps we can include this angle also, and Geological Society will be very happy to host or promote this this type of research. So please look into the opportunity and let us work together.
That is very good. I welcome any questions and comments from any of the young people and also the older people. We can always collaborate and do things together. So thank you for hosting me. Thank you for your time. And this is just the beginning, I think, of a very long-term relationship with NGS.
Good. Thank you very much. And perhaps you should take a rest now. If the time is.
It's almost 8:30. Almost 8:30 in the evening. So that is all right.
You still have time for your dinner. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
So goodbye. Goodbye and good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Dhanyabad.
Bye bye.
Namaste. Namaste. Dhanyabad.